His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I'm your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. This is sort of an unintended sequel to last episode in which we were talking about the crash of test pilot Bruce Tuttle on Long Island Sound. We are returning to that body of water and to another unfortunate incident, one unfortunately with not as many survivors, and one as told by a very special returning guest, Bill Bleyer. Quick note, in the last few minutes you'll notice a shift in Bill's mic. That's a long story, but nothing that will obscure the facts. And in case you're asking, who is Bill Bleyer?
I am a retired Newsday reporter who is still freelancing for Newsday and magazines. My primary thing these days is writing Long Island history books, and my sixth book for the History Press will be officially published May 1st. It's The Sinking of the Steamboat Lexington on Long Island Sound, and it's about the worst maritime disaster in Long Island history.
And it's made me think, Bill, I don't know if you're a loyal listener or not, but we just finished up an episode on a 1950s Grumman plane crash on the Sound, and now we're going back in time to your book. The Sound was a very dangerous place, I'm thinking. I'm used to it, the gentle ferry crossings we have these days, but it was really... What would you say about the body of water itself, the Long Island Sound?
Well, it's not as treacherous as the Atlantic Ocean can be, but it can get pretty rough, as people, have seen in Superstorm Sandy and the nor'easters in 1992 and 1993 that flooded a lot of Bayville, where I live, and other coastal communities. But you also have to realize, if in the early days of navigation, before they had even lighthouses or electronic navigation, you're moving down the Sound, you have all these headlands left behind by the glaciers, with rock reefs going out from Sands Point and Oyster Bay and Eaton's Neck, and all these headlands along the shores. So if you lost control of your vessel or lost track of where you were, there were lots of wrecks on Long Island Sound, not as many as in the ocean, but certainly many disasters. And then the technology and the safety equipment early on wasn't what it like now. In the 1800s, the steamboats were new technology, and there were a lot of explosions and fires early on because they were sort of inventing on the run.
Right, and then just to play that out, if you go all the way to the west, if you're heading to New York or coming out of New York, Manhattan, you've got to pass through Hellgate, and that was a known, very treacherous passing, right?
Right, and for many years, sailing vessels would go through, and they'd have to time it with to go through with the tide and the current. And then they'd have to avoid all these rocks and whirlpools, and a lot of times they didn't make it. And when the steamboat technology, a couple of years after Robert Fulton sort of perfected the first steamboat in the New York area, one of his employees, Captain Elihu Bunker, who plays a role in the Lexington story, is the first steamboat captain to successfully get through Hellgate, and in an 11-hour trip gets from New York City out to New Haven, Connecticut, and then opens this whole window, for this great new age of transportation on Long Island Sound.
Just on that, in terms of the approach to New York City, the Sound, taking the Sound versus the South Shore, is there anything in general you can say, or how you would characterize what traffic was going through the Sound as opposed to going along the South Shore?
The South Shore had all the traffic coming from the South, had all the traffic pretty much coming from Europe, and even a lot of traffic from New England, because a lot of captains just thought it was better to make the longer loop around Montauk and follow the South Shore, which is sort of a straight line. The problem with the South Shore is you have all these sandbars, sometimes half a mile offshore, and in bad visibility or in a storm or at night, you could run into that sandbar and wreck your vessel without even seeing the mainland of Long Island. The Sound, you have all these turns you have to make to get around Crane Neck by Port Jefferson and around Eaton's Neck, and then through these areas like Execution Rocks and places of rock reefs in the Sound that could even out in the middle, apparently you'd be out in the middle of the sound, but you could still hit a reef rock and destroy your ship.
And then just again, in terms of the history of movement of peoples and commerce, eventually the connections across the sound, obviously Connecticut's right across and Rhode Island. So what's most in my mind, since we just talked about the Culper Spy Ring, was sort of the raids across the sound. But so, I mean, a lot of the traffic, would you say, was interstate, like so from Long Island up to obviously the bottom edge of New England there?
Yeah, well, you've always, going back to the earliest colonial days and even to the Native Americans, they were trading across the Sound. Native Americans were trading all the way up to the Great Lakes. But when the steamboat age came, it's sort of like the same thing as the Long Island Railroad. People think of the Long Island Railroad now, it's serving Long Island. It was not built to serve Long Island. It was served to get people the length of Long Island onto a ferry to get to Boston. And it was the same thing with the steamboats. I mean, they initially had no interest in serving harbors on either side of the Sound. They were trying to get people to Boston. And the way they did that to avoid a 2 or 3 day stagecoach ride was they would go as far east on the Sound as they could on the Connecticut side as the time and the technology allowed. And they would connect initially with stagecoaches and then with railroads working southwest from Boston, because closer to New York, you had multiple rivers and mountain, hills and things. And the technology just was not available to build a railroad from New York to Boston, in any kind of affordable, technologically available way. So you have this kind of reaching out from both ends, steamboat on the west and railroads coming down from Boston. And that's where the Lexington and all these other steamboats were. But they weren't really serving these harbors. That was just a changeover point for passengers going from one city to the other. It
was sail over country. They were just trying to get across. So in terms of that, and as I was reading your book, it made me think of this era, I'm going to say pre-1844, because that's just the completion of the Long Island Railroad, basically. But it made me think of this as trains versus steamboats, part one. So do you want to talk about the coming of the steam age and where steam fit in terms of transportation and I guess economic potential?
I mean, steam was a huge change in culture, industry, and everything. Before that, people were relying on sailing, and you have to deal with more with the weather, currents, and transportation was much more unpredictable. So the steamboats, shortly after that 1815 trip by L.U. Bunker, you start to have regularly scheduled steamboat service. Now there was regularly scheduled sailing vessels even crossing the Atlantic. They were called packet ships. But the schedule meant they were left on a certain day, but there was no guarantee when they would arrive. Depending on the wind, the currents, and storms. The steamboats, other than really extreme weather, would pretty much stay on schedule. So this it also lowered the cost considerably of these trips. So you start to have middle class, working class people being able to move much more freely than they would have earlier on. So it's really transformation in the way people lived, worked, traveled, and this carries over ultimately to the railroads, which and you actually see people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who builds the Lexington, eventually abandons steamboats for the railroads and monopolizes them like he had with the steamboat trade. So it's sort of a progression from sail to steam vessels. And then the railroads pretty much eclipse all these steamboats. Although they do stick around into the early 1900s, it's only when you start to see the bridges being built, particularly the Whitestone Bridge, that all the steamboat companies finally go out of business on the Sound.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, no, when I was reading about Cornelius Vanderbilt, that is where that idea struck me. Like, he was putting his money on steamboats or, shipping. That's where he came from. But he eventually saw railroads eclipsing it. But at this time frame that we're talking early 1800s, the money was in steamboats. Do you want to say a little about the people that were running, or the companies or the entrepreneurs that were initiating all these steamboat lines?
Well, Vanderbilt's actually a really interesting case, because he was really lagging on the technology all the way along. He started out his career, sailing people and cargo around New York Harbor from his home in Staten Island. He thought steamboats were a fad that wasn't going to take. So he waited years before he even really investigated them. And then he took a trip up the Hudson on one of the steamboat lines to Albany and back, and, spent a lot of time studying the technology on board, and decided this was something he wanted to get into. So he sort of shifted over to steamboats, started working for a steamboat entrepreneur from New Jersey, and then started, getting buying interest into steamboats, and then buying his own, and then eventually building his own company. And he got very late into railroads, in part because he was in one of the first major railroad accidents in the country in New Jersey. It almost killed him. So he was not a big fan of railroads early on either. But when he was relentless competitor, and basically had fare wars his whole life, both on this, sailing on New York Harbor, then steamboats on New York Harbor, on the Hudson, and then Long Island Sound. And when he got into something, he was, fully invested and extremely innovative. So you have a lot of companies. Typically, you have a company starting all up and down the coast in New England because the business interest in, say, Stonington, Connecticut, or New London, New Haven, Providence, Rhode Island, they wanted to bring business and trade and cargo and passengers into their cities. So they would band together, create a company, and start to build steamboats and start a steamboat line. They would also build railroads on the New England end, and a lot of times it was the same people forming two different companies that would connect. So you'd have the New Jersey Steam Transportation Company running steamboats, and then you'd have another railroad run by the same people under a different corporate name, and then they would coordinate their schedules and try to build business on both ends of the operation.
And then even with Vanderbilt, he was so feared. One of his tactics, I think, was starting a line in competition and then taking money. People would pay him not to run the line.
Yeah, that happened several times. It happened in the city. Then he was competing and beating everybody. He was usually technologically ahead of his competitors. He was just so relentless that he would cut costs. He was better at marketing, better at organization, better at designing, and he designed his own boats. So he was better in every aspect of the business, so he could afford to cut his costs and run his competitors into the ground. So the consortium of entrepreneurs that were running steamboats, the major company on the Hudson, finally basically paid him to go away, gave him a lot of money up front, gave him an annual annuity to stay off the Hudson. So he invested that money in steamboats to run on Long Island. So he built a bunch of them, and was always looking for a faster, better, more luxurious boat, safer boat, which is important, and kept outdistancing his competitors. And he would run fare wars with them and either put them out of business or get them to buy him out, which ultimately happened even with the Lexington.
So he was active. If we say the 1830s, he was actively running lines. Was he the dominant line across the Sound?
He wasn't the dominant one. And the company, and there's different company names because they'd be chartered in different states as the laws change. He wasn't the biggest. He was always sort of the underdog, which actually got him a lot of popular support in the press and from the public. But he generally had the best boats, so he might be running 3 boats against the company with 10 boats, but his boats were generally faster, safer, more luxurious. And then he would run, he would always compete them favorably with fares. So he would do things like, the typical, when he got onto Long Island Sound, the boats were generally running a fare of $8 one way to whatever port in New England they were going to from New York. And he would start a fare war and keep dropping the prices. At some point, get down to $1.50. And in some places, either on the Hudson or the Sound, he would actually drop the fare to $0, but he'd make money by charging for everything else. Sort of like Spirit Airlines, he would charge for the food. He would charge to use it, to have a bunk. So the basic ride, if you wanted to ride on deck, was free. But anything else, like having a bunk in the cabin, having a meal, anything else, he would charge for it. So he'd make money that way. But he always undercut the competitors on the operation. And his boats were more efficient, burn less fuel, or faster, so he can afford to do that. And the competitors were always chasing him.
So let's bring in the main attraction. When did he conceive or start building the Lexington steamship?
Basically designed it, and back then they didn't have blueprints. What they would do is they would build what was called a half model, which is basically half of a three-dimensional model from the side. So he worked primarily with a shipyard owned by his son-in-law and a partner, Simonson, down in Lower Manhattan. So one day he walks in with a half model for the Lexington. And this was a totally unique boat, unlike anything anybody else had ever built, because he didn't design it like a typical vessel. He actually found a book of plans for bridges and realized that this sort of curved truss design that he saw for a bridge, he could build that into a steamboat, make it lighter and faster and stronger than anything on the water. And that's what they did. So they were like stunned when he brought this in. But he said, build this model, build it stronger, faster than anything else out on the Sound. And typically these steamboats that he was competing with would have two large steam engines and burn a lot of wood. He said, I want one bigger engine instead of two smaller ones, and I want the paddle wheels to be 50% bigger than anything on the Sound, and I can save a lot of fuel with one bigger engine than I can with two. And that's when they built. So when this Lexington gets launched in 1835, it's cruising up to 17 miles an hour, which is about 50% faster than anything else out there, burning 50% less fuel. And he spared no expense, both on the construction and the safety, but particularly on the furnishing. So everything is teak, plush. This is sort of a nice Victorian, very fancy boat, and people flocked to it, and it was an immediate success.
And it was roughly a 13-hour trip people were getting on board for?
It was typically about 13 hours to get out to central Connecticut, and he shaved that down to like 7 or 8 hours as soon as they launched it. So people, for obvious reasons, flocked to his boats.
So would people they could get berths? Were there sleeping quarters on the boats, or?
There weren't any cabins, at least in the early years, like people think of staterooms. Initially, there were no sleeping accommodations at all. People they had a grand central room, a saloon as they called it, and then they would have maybe a separate one for women. But they were basically big open spaces with chairs and sofas, and people would try to sleep because the boats would typically leave New York like late afternoon, get out to Stonington or Providence or New Haven, middle of the night, 2-3 o'clock in the morning. Then they have to transfer to trains, and they get to Boston sometime the next day. But eventually, they started putting in bunks along the side of these saloons, and then you would pay extra for that. Okay. They'd also have the chef with assistants and waiters, so they would serve fairly fancy meals on the trip.
So I think you probably wisely resisted this, but could you call this Vanderbilt's Titanic?
Well, when the Lexington goes down, it was sort of the Titanic of its era because stepping back a second, so he ran it from 1835 to 1839, and then he forces his competitors, the New Jersey Steam Transportation Company, to buy it after running a series of fare wars and races. And actually, the competitors actually built a faster boat, but even that for whatever reason, did not dampen the Lexington's enthusiasm, the Lexington from the press and the public. People went on both boats, but the Lexington was still popular. So
the people's favorite. And why did he want to sell? Was he looking to get out of something? Or?
No, it's basically he was always looking ahead. So he was thinking after 4 years of operation that the boat was getting a little old, that there was better new technology. He wanted something bigger, faster, and safer so that he could, stay ahead of the pack. So he basically blackmails the New Jersey Steam Transportation Company into buying the Lexington for $60,000 when bankers who were part of the deal thought it was worth half that. And they, the company basically, in the record, when you read the letters and things, and the testimony at the inquest after the sinking, but they basically bought the boat to get rid of him, and he agreed not to operate on the Sound and compete with them, which didn't last long because he came back with new boats and ran against them. So that was it. So he basically took the money from the Lexington, put it into newer boats. But so the new owners got to run it for a year till January of 1840, and then they had their fatal last voyage.
And they converted, right? You were saying it was a wood burning.
Yeah, one of the things they did after they bought it is they spent $60,000 to buy it. They put another $12,000 in to modernize it, upgrade it, and particularly convert it to burning coal, which was being done more and more with all the steamboats around the country and around the world at that point, because the coal burned hotter, you got more steam longer, for the same amount of fuel. Some of the early steamboats actually had to tow a schooner full of wood behind them to refuel as they were running up the coast. So they had to reconfigure the boilers, put more safety provisions around them. They would put like steel, iron plates above the boilers and around the boilers. Under them, they would put like a pan of water below them just because the fire was hotter, to protect against fire. But it was controversial early on, there were a lot of explosions because the boilers couldn't handle the pressure. And then when you see the switch to coal, you don't see so many explosions, but you do see fires because either they would open the doors to throw coal in and the flame would jump out, or the boilers weren't designed properly to handle the coal fire. So you might have a fire breaking out of the chimney. So there was some incidents of fire, nothing as serious until the Lexington burns. And then in the aftermath of that, you have this huge debate about the safety of coal burning on steamboats, which dominates the testimony at the inquest after the sinking.
And so the New Jersey company is running the same line with the Lexington, and it's January 13th, 1840. It was just a normal run they were on. They were heading to Stonington out of New York.
It was normal, except the fact that there was a huge cold wave, and the Lexington was such a strong boat that the company, it was actually supposed to run the next night, and a different boat was supposed to run on the afternoon of the 13th. And the superintendent of the line flipped it to have the Lexington run because the Lexington was so strong. There was ice on the East River, even ice sheets on the Sound, and they decided that the Lexington was the better boat to run in those conditions. So it was 4 degrees when they left, and by the middle of the night, it was like 17 below. But other than that, it was a routine trip. They had a full load of cargo. The primary cargo was 150 bales of cotton, which was typical steamboat cargo because the cotton would come up from the south, and instead of going directly to New England, it would come to New York and be transshipped by steamboat to the mills in New England. There was also other cargo. They had some wagons. They had also had a lot of gold and silver coins for going to a bank in Boston. And crew of about 35. The total number of people on board is still undetermined. For a long period of time, most of the published sources had it at 143. But in going over all the records of who was on board, the obituaries, the missing persons reports, I put it closer to 150. But we'll never know because they didn't do a passenger list. They had a list of the crew, but they never actually, there was no list that survived of who actually got on board the steamboat.
And from what you did learn, how would you characterize the range of people that were on the boat that night?
It was an interesting mix. You had a lot of businessmen going from New York to Boston, a bank owner, a sort of contractor from Massachusetts, a lot of traveling representatives of companies, shoes companies and other companies. You also had 5 ocean-going ship captains going home to New England as passengers. One of them is Chester Hilliard, 20-year-old ship captain, who's one of the 4 survivors and actually plays a major role in saving anybody. And then you have people from England, people from New Orleans, all over the Northeast. And then you have a woman who had just gotten married the day before, and her parents didn't know about it. So she's traveling back to New England without her husband to tell her parents that she's now a wife. So she's a bride for a day. You have one woman who had just buried her husband, so she's traveling with the coffin and 4 other family members back for the burial, and none of them survive. So it's a pretty interesting mix.
And it got out of Hellgate. It got across as they were heading out. How far did they get before the first sign of trouble?
They served dinner sort of around 6 p.m. off of Sands Point, Port Washington area. Then about 8 o'clock, about 7 o'clock, they're off of Eaton's Neck, off of Huntington. They have a full-time pilot who's in charge of actually running the boat, steering the boat, named Stephen Manchester, and he's steering up in the pilot house with a helmsman. One of the crew comes into the wheelhouse and says the boat's on fire. So Manchester turns around, goes out of the wheelhouse back onto the promenade deck where the smokestack comes up through the hull, and sees flames all around the smokestack. At the same time, the captain, who's not in the wheelhouse, is alerted, and the crew starts to see this, and people are reacting, as well as passengers who happen to be on deck, although there's not a lot of people on deck in the middle of the night, when it's below freezing.
So cold, yeah.
So when you have a fire on a wooden steamboat with a lot of paint and varnish, that it's very difficult to contain the fire. So Manchester almost instinctively, with the helmsman and then the captain who comes in, and the 3 of them are basically, turning the wheel to turn right to head for Eaton's Neck, which is the closest land. And when they do that, something snaps and the wheel just turns without any kind of restriction on it. And they realize there are iron rods running down under that promenade deck, but on either end, on the rudder end and on the steering wheel end, they're connected to the rudder and the steering wheel with rawhide ropes, because there had been experiments using chains, and the chains sort of kinked up or got brittle in the cold and broke. So most of the boats were running with these rawhide ropes, which work very well, except when there's a fire. And so the fire burns through the ropes and disconnects the steering wheel from the rest of the steering apparatus. So the boat continues at cruising speed of 13 miles an hour heading northeast towards Stonington, so they can't control the boat.
And the boilers are still going,
The
right?
boilers are still going.
The engine is still,
because the fire is observed on the top deck around the smokestack, but it clearly started, at the furnace and then burned up. So it drove the engineering crew away from the steam engine. They couldn't get to it to release the pressure. So until the pressure was burned out on its own, the boat continues at 13 miles an hour heading towards Stonington, which creates all kinds of problems for fighting the fire. It's fanning the flames. They have a portable fire engine, basically a portable fire pump, which they get it up and running, but the hose for it runs back into the fire by the furnace, so it's useless because they can't direct the water anywhere. And then they try to launch the 3 lifeboats. The obvious thing, and they knew this, was to wait until the boat stopped, because if you're trying to put a lifeboat over the side and put people in it at 13 miles an hour, it's not going to be easy. But because the fire was spreading so quickly and the passengers were panicking, they try to launch the lifeboats. The 2 on either side towards the stern get down in the water and overturn swamp, and everybody drowns or freezes to death. Manchester helps launch the one up on the promenade deck by the wheelhouse and tells the crew to make sure you tie it to the bow of the boat so it doesn't get swept back and get crushed by the paddle wheel. But whatever happened, it didn't work. The boat just gets away from them. I guess it wasn't tied properly and goes back and gets run over by the paddle wheels. So
with people in the boat?
Not in that boat. The 2 lifeboats in the back were full of people, including the captain. What happened is they're trying to lower the lifeboat with people in it, and the captain is helping. Somebody cuts one of the bow tackle, so the boat drops. It's still attached on the stern, drops in the bow, floods, turns over, and they're all swept away. And they did find one of the boats on shore 2 days later by the Oldfield Point Lighthouse with people frozen in it. So I guess it was swamped, and then the cold just overtook them, and then it froze.
Now, just to do the math, even if we take the 150 number that you're positing, 3 lifeboats, how big were the lifeboats? And does that seem adequate, or? No,
this is, again, a Titanic comparison. They were designed, the 2 bigger ones in the stern were designed, I think, to hold 30 people, and the smaller one maybe 20. But even at the inquest, there was testimony from the crew saying that, that they thought those numbers were design numbers that really wouldn't work in the real world. So probably, at best, they maybe had capacity for a third of the people on board.
And so how long does this horrible scenario last, where it's chugging along on fire, still above water, but people are panicking? And
the steam pressure dissipated after about 20 minutes. But in that 20 minutes, they had attempted to launch the lifeboats and lost them. So they're basically now dependent on life jackets or whatever they can throw overboard, which Manchester is up on the bow. He gets people to build a raft out of pieces of their ship and luggage and things, which doesn't hold together, and really work. But the people are jumping overboard and drowning and freezing. But the 2 people who are left that do play the major role in the fact that they survive and other people have a chance of surviving is this Captain Chester Hilliard, the ocean-going ship captain, who's a passenger. He goes up to the wheelhouse, to see what's going on, talks to the captain of Manchester, realizes that the ship is out of control, goes back and watches them launch the lifeboats. And, he's a professional mariner. And after the 2 lifeboats are lost, he basically yells at people, stay on board, wait till the ship stops or you're doomed. And about 20 people around him listen to him, which gives them a fighting chance. And when the ship finally stops, he says, okay, take these cotton bales, which become very controversial later because some of them are actually burning. He says, throw them overboard. They'll be your life raft. So some of them are on fire, but when they're thrown overboard, the fire is extinguished. Some of them haven't caught yet. But people climb onto these things and are saved, at least some of them temporarily. And three of the four survivors, that's how they survive, is on cotton bales. Manchester is up on the bow with about 30 people, and the motion and the wind is blowing the flames somewhat back towards the stern, but the fire is still advancing towards the bow. But he stays up there till midnight. Now, basically, like Hilliard and everybody else is off the middle of the ship is gone by around 8 o'clock. But Manchester keeps everybody up with him on the bow, on the boat, until about midnight, at which point he thinks it's about to sink. So at that point, they build the raft. The raft doesn't work, and they start throwing pieces overboard and whatever cotton they can get to. And so they go overboard about midnight, and Lexington actually doesn't sink until about 3 in the morning, northwest of Port Jefferson. And people on both sides of the Sound are seeing the flames, and
I was just thinking that, right? Because even, again, the Titanic's in my mind with the lights, but at least it was on fire, so they could see the burning mass out in the Sound.
Right. The lighthouse keeper at Oldfield Point in Setauket area, he sees it. Ship captains in port, particularly in Stony Brook and over in Stonington, Connecticut, see it. And actually, some of them actually try to get their sailboats out to help and look for survivors. There's a sloop called the Merchant in Stonington, Connecticut, and the captain tries to get out, but it's low tide and there's ice flows at the entrance to the harbor, so he can't get out. And there's actually a Brookhaven sloop out on the Sound, but they're like 6 miles downwind, down current from the Lexington. And the captain decides not to try because it would have taken him hours and hours to tack up against the prevailing wind and tide to get there. So he figured that they had lifeboats, and by the time he got there, whatever was going to happen was going to happen. And he was widely criticized afterwards for not, making the attempt, and rightly so, because even if it took him hours and hours, he would have still been the first person to get to the area.
So from all the evidence you pieced together, 150 on the ship, it burns, it sinks. How many do you think, or can you say, were alive on the water?
There were, good question. There were at least, maybe a dozen or so, could be 20, initially were on some kind of wreckage or had a life jacket and didn't die immediately of hypothermia. But, keep in mind, there's a wind blowing. The temperature is now, one of the people who gets involved in the rescue later recorded a temperature of 19 below out in Riverhead that night. And people got on the wreckage. One of the engineering staff, Charles Smith, survives. He started out on a cotton bale and then was able to get on a big piece of the wooden paddle guard that went over the paddle wheel. And that's how he survives. And he talks about there were several other people, including the chief engineer, on the paddle guard with him, and eventually, one after the other, they just died of hypothermia and fell overboard. And actually, the chief engineer died on the paddle guard, but stayed there. So he was actually one of the few people whose body was recovered, so he could be buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. A lot of these cotton bales had 2 people, and then one would die of hypothermia and fall overboard. And the only way when there were 2 people on board, the only way they could do this was have their feet in the water. Which means you're not going to be very warm. And then in at least one case of Chester Hilliard, the ship captain who survives, he's on board with one of the passengers. About 4 a.m, a big wave comes along and tips them over. So they're now in the water, fully soaked. They were able to climb back on the other side of the cotton bale, but the passenger with him is basically insensible after that, and doesn't survive long. And when he dies and falls overboard, then at least Hilliard could get fully up on the thing and get out of the water. But he's soaked. He doesn't have, I think he's got his coat on because he took it out of, when he went up on deck. So he survives on a cotton bale. He's picked up. Captain Meeker of the Merchant tries again at high tide the next morning. He gets out. So he's the actual first vessel to get in the area. So he rescues Hilliard. He rescues Manchester and Charles Smith, the engineering coal loader, between 1 and 2 o'clock the next day, and they're basically suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. He recovers a few bodies, and that's it. So that's 3 survivors. And initially, people think that's all there is, and the press picks up on this. The Connecticut papers start to cover it the next day, and then the New York papers the day after that. So the initial reports coming down from Connecticut is that there's 3 survivors. And then word from Telegraph reaches the city that there's a 4th survivor, who's the second mate, David Crowley. And this is the most amazing story. He goes overboard somewhere after 8 o'clock and before midnight when Manchester goes over. He's lucky enough to get on his own. I guess he pushes over his own cotton bale. I don't think he even got wet. He was even able to burrow into the cotton a little for insulation, but he's only got his shirt and a vest on, no hat or anything. So he's drifting east. He sees the merchant picking up the other 3, but he's so far to the east that he's trying to wave and they don't see him. They don't see him, so they don't rescue him. So he starts to drift, and he gets near the Connecticut shore. At one point, he gets near Faulkner Island off the Connecticut coast. He's got a wood stick, piece of wood he's using as a paddle, but he can't get close enough to actually get to the beach. So he drifts towards Connecticut. He drifts by this island, and eventually, 48 hours after he goes over, he washes up on the beach in Riverhead in Baiting Hollow, severely frostbitten. There's also huge ridges of ice built up along the shore from this cold weather. So he crawls up over this mountain of ice to get to the actual beach. Then he stumbles or crawls 3/4 of a mile. He sees a house down the beach with a light burning. So he manages, after all this, to get to this house and knock on the door, and then he passes out. Luckily, there's a couple home with their young son, who's a businessman in the city, who's visiting. They take him in, they strip off his clothes and realize his hands and feet are fully frozen. The wife, Mrs. Hutchinson, describes this later in a published account, is that his hands and feet look like they were made out of marble. Luckily, they knew how to treat it, so they put him in a cold room in the house, like a storage room, to start slowly warming him, because if you warm somebody up with frostbite, you're going to get gangrene and end up losing your limbs. So overnight, they put him in the room and bathe his limbs initially in cold water and slowly warm the room and the water. So by the morning, he can actually talk. And in the morning, he can actually, they give him some beef tea that he can drink. And the first thing he says, he tells them about the steamboat disaster, which was news to them. And then right after that, tells them how he survived. And he says, "Can you go down on the beach and get the cotton bale? I'd like to keep it as the means of my survival, as a souvenir." So they do that. He's so badly injured and so compromised health-wise, he can't go home to Providence for 9 months. He stays with this couple for 9 months recuperating.
Oh, wow.
Before he's strong enough to go home.
Good Samaritans.
Yeah. But he becomes something of a celebrity on Long Island and around the region for surviving. And then, people are following his recovery because it's such an amazing story.
Yeah. And you mentioned the press coverage, which I wanted to get some highlights of, because obviously it predates the Titanic, but as an exemplar of a horrible nautical disaster, it seems like this would have loomed large in history. Was it a big news story and seep into the popular culture imagination?
It got huge press coverage at the time. There were a lot of steamboat explosions, even before the Lexington, a lot afterwards. At the time, it was the worst steamboat death toll from a fire. There was some explosions that were more deadly. And then there were later fires and explosions, particularly out on the Mississippi and the Western rivers, that were worse. So it got eclipsed, but at the time it was covered all. The news from New York spread to national newspapers and newspapers all around the country. So it takes about a month or so for some of the coverage to actually reach the West Coast, but it was a big deal. A lot of criticism of the steamboat company, of burning coal, of carrying cotton of cargo. People are demanding, the newspapers, editorials demanding that the owners of the company or the officers on board, should be indicted for murder. And then a week after the sinking, there's an 8-day inquest, and there's a jury of a dozen men who none of them have any maritime experience at all, let alone steamboats. So they come out with this damning report criticizing the company, criticizing the officers, saying, the crew panicked, that the boiler was unsafe for burning coal, that it was unsafe to carry cotton as a cargo, and, on and on. And that's the story that got out in the media, got out to the world, and that's what everybody, including me, thought about the Lexington, and for years, and all the published accounts, even in more recent books, that's what you read about the Lexington. That the ship was old, the ship wasn't badly maintained, was converted unsafely for coal, that cotton cargo was dangerous. And when you actually read the testimony from not only the people involved with the Lexington, but the federal steamboat inspectors, including L.U. Bunker, other engineers, and foundry workers, all this was it was a kangaroo court. I mean, these people did not know what they were talking about. They had preconceived notions. Even the coroner, who impanels the inquest, basically criticizes their verdict. Experts from the Navy and the commercial shipping industry are criticizing it, picking the whole thing apart. But if you didn't actually read the inquest testimony, you wouldn't know that. And most people in the later years did not do that. So I was very surprised. I started out, with a totally different view of the accident, and then did a 180 flip when I really, read all the testimony. But in chronological order, newspapers back then didn't have front page news. They had ads on the front page, but there's extensive coverage, sometimes almost the full page in the daily papers in Brooklyn and Long Island. The inquest is covered extensively. The recovery of bodies. The steamboat company sent out another steamboat to look for survivors and recover bodies and luggage. All this is covered extensively. The New York Sun is the biggest daily paper in the country and in the city. So they start to do the coverage 2 days after the sinking. Then they're doing special extra editions. And the first one just has a sort of a woodcut of a generic steamboat not on fire. The next day they have a woodcut lithograph, black and white, of a steamboat on fire, and it's kind of primitive. But what happens is the day that they learn of the fire, they approach a young lithographer named Nathaniel Currier, who's also down in Lower Manhattan, and he had sort of created a specialty of doing disaster coverage. He had done big fires, lithographs of big fires in New York City and other disasters. He actually did, 5 years before the Lexington, did a lithograph of the sailing vessel Mexico running aground and killing most of the people on board down on the south shore of Long Island. So he had something of a reputation in the industry. The Sun editor hires him, saying, how fast can you turn out a lithograph so we can actually show people what this looked like? Every day the Sun is putting out extra editions that are selling out. They're selling thousands of copies. People are lined up outside their office to buy these extra editions, which are a full page, one-sided sheet. We know by day 10 of their doing these extras that they have signed lithographs from the Courier, and they probably somewhere in the middle they started to have early versions from Courier. But eventually these things are extremely detailed, and then some of them are hand colored. So the Sun would print a black and white lithograph image, and then Courier would have a team of women each doing a different color, hand coloring each of these thousands of special editions. And it's a huge thing, big deal. The Sun at the end did it for a couple of weeks, sold about 12,000 copies of this extra. And then Courier takes the image and starts to print his own version. And each day they would have new testimony from the inquest on the bottom half of the page, and the color lithograph or black lithograph on top. So Courier starts to print his own variation of this, and does this for 11 months and sells tens of thousands of more copies, which sold all around the world. So this is the first known newspaper illustrated extra edition. This also makes a star lithographer out of Nathaniel Courier, who later partners with Ives and has a very successful company into the early 1900s. There's also a lot of other lithographs coming out, including two in France, and companies all around the Northeast are putting them out.
So in terms of the press coverage, this was a story that ran for a long time, and so people would have seen it, the aftermath, and like you're saying, the inquest, and it made the career of at least Courier.
Well, it got press coverage probably for about a year because they kept recovering bodies, and then with litigation, the one case from the Boston bank that had the $25,000 in coins being shipped sued the company. The shipping companies were sort of immune from being liable for damage from a shipwreck, and the bank sued, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and won. They basically created this new body of law that there was limited liability for the company, but not in the case of negligence. And the Supreme Court read the inquest and decided that the company was negligent and ruled for the bank.
So they actually raised the ship at least once, right? Or twice.
Right. First, they started to just try to, find cargo, particularly, the valuables. And then in 1842, they had the idea of actually sending divers down and raising the ship. And they actually got it right up to the surface, supported by two big cables, but it wasn't supported sufficiently. And the hull, fire damage as it was, broke in half. And one of the paddle wheels fell off, and it all fell back down 140 feet into the Sound. So then they tried in 1850 to do partial salvage again. And each time they brought up anchors and some money, pieces of the wreckage. Some of it was actually displayed down in Battery Park in New York. And the other thing we should talk about is the safety legislation. There was a steamboat safety law passed 1839, required inspections of the boilers and, required fire equipment, a lot of things. There was a loud outcry after the Lexington to change that, but based on Supreme Court rulings, Congress wasn't sure how much authority they had to actually change the safety laws. They were also kind of loath to interfere with free commerce. So it took a dozen years to pass an upgrade of that initial Safety Act after 1840. So it's not till 1852 that they passed this thing and required more inspections, better inspections, more safety equipment.
So the other thing that's interesting, I mentioned I was just doing an episode on a plane that crashed, and they were doing some side scanning looking for it, and they mentioned Ben Roberts, a diver that turns up in your book. So do you want to talk a little about the later attempts? So the fact that they raised it in the 1850s, they knew where it sunk, right? Was that knowledge lost over time, or? Well,
the first salvage company went out, it was about a month, I think, after the sinking and found it. They had basically worked on, had the survivor testimony. They had information from the lighthouse keeper. So they had a pretty good idea where it went down. And that knowledge was retained right up through the 1850. Then it was kind of lost until 1983. Clive Klessler, the adventure book author, in his spare time liked to go find famous shipwrecks. He decided, because of the infamy and the extent of the disaster, to find the Lexington. So he commissioned people on Long Island and Washington to do research, figured out where it was likely, hired a dive boat and a crew to go out with primitive side scan sonar and a magnetometer, and located the wreck. And then in 1983, he put together a team to go actually dive the wreck. And it turned out the people he hired were basically amateur divers, with inferior, inadequate equipment. But a gentleman named Robert Wass from Smithtown, who was both a commercial diver and the owner of a dive shop in Bayshore, read about what Cussler was about to do in the newspapers, tracks him down to his hotel in Manhattan, calls him up, and talks his way onto the expedition. And it turns out that Wass is the only one of the divers who actually gets down 140 feet and reaches the wreck. He brings up some charred wood and some metal fittings. The wood is tested up at Woods Hole Laboratory and dated to prove that it was dated from 1830, which proved that was the Lexington. And Cussler donates what they brought up to the Vanderbilt Museum, which has now loaned it to the SUNY Maritime Museum in Fort Schuyler in the Bronx. And then Ben Roberts, who was a diver, who worked as a mate. He was an investment counselor, but he worked as a mate on dive boats, was a pretty hardcore diver, but he was into side scan sonar and actually created a company with a friend to do commercial side scan. But most of the time he was just going out and scanning wrecks for the fun of it. So they had found a wreck of a Civil War ship sunk by a Confederate raider off of Montauk. I had done a Newsday story about that, got to know Ben. So, I knew what Ben was doing. And so I said, I'm going to do a book on the Lexington at some point, and it would be great if you could go scan what's out there so people can get a sense of it. So in the summer of 2020, we arranged for him to go out there and spend a half a day, and he scanned, got great images of the bow and stern section and one of the paddle wheels. The other one is probably either buried in the silt or disintegrated. Then I have that in the book, and you can see very clearly what the wreckage looks like, including this latticework structure that was what Vanderbilt designed based on the bridge pattern. So it looks like all these little boxes rather than a ship hull. So that is the best image to date of what the wreckage looks like.
So what do you think is is the legacy of the Lexington, or what endures from the story, or what do you want to be known about it?
Well, the legacy is the transportation has evolved, going back all the way back to Native Americans and their dugout canoes and their birch bark canoes. It's been an ongoing process, and there's a lot of trial and error and a lot of disasters along the way. Some of them clearly negligent. You had a lot of steamboat companies opening the safety valves on their steam engines so they could run faster, and then having fires and explosions. This clearly wasn't the case with the Lexington, but along the way, there's a lot of trial and error, a lot of disasters. And the Lexington is a very good illustration of what can go wrong along the way. And I lecture about maritime accidents around Long Island. And the last serious one was 1962 with a tugboat that sinks in a big nor'easter off of Huntington. And that was only 8 people. So, as the technology has gotten better, the navigation equipment is better, the safety equipment is better, these things are much less common. You see these kind of accidents still happening around the world, but in the United States, as you get into the 1900s, you don't in domestic travel, you don't see these kind of accidents anymore. So it's it's part of this process, and you have some pretty dramatic stories along the way.
And thank you again to Bill for sharing that. It was a fascinating conversation. His new book is The Sinking of the Steamboat Lexington on Long Island Sound. It will be out May 1st from History Press. As you heard him say, there'll be a kickoff celebration at the Suffolk County Historical Society in Riverhead. That's on April 15th. We will have links to all of this and related resources in our show notes at longislandhistoryproject.org. And if you have your own story to tell, if you have a piece of Long Island history in your family or something you've been researching, or just want to suggest a topic, drop us a line. You can reach us directly at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. Always great to hear from the people out there that are listening. That does it for this episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.